Greetings once again and welcome back. This is Gary Miranda, and today I'm going to be sharing with you some poems that are either about or were inspired by members of my family. Families are, for better or worse, the source of many of our most powerful memories, and in my case the memories are by and large for the better. A happy childhood may not be the most fecund breeding ground for a poet, but I'm here to tell you that with dedication and hard work, that handicap can be overcome. This first poem is called Sonnet for Salvador. I mentioned in an earlier podcast that I don't like to call attention to my rhymes, but when you go through all the trouble of working in a fixed form like a sonnet, it's hard not to advertise the achievement. The Salvador in question was my grandfather, Salvador Miranda, who came over from Calabria, Italy in 1896 and migrated, God only knows why or how, to Lewiston, Idaho. He became a truck farmer and was the only farmer in the Lewiston Valley who could raise celery, as the climate wasn't conducive to it. He trucked celery to families as far away as Walla Walla, Washington, and eventually became known throughout the area as the Celery King. His other claim to fame was that he built a cabin that is the oldest surviving wooden structure in Lewiston, and that now resides at the Nez Perce Historical Society, with a plaque that boasts a photograph of Salvador and his wife Maria, along with their 7 surviving children, including my father, Dominic. I never knew Salvador. He died when I was 3, and know only those scattered facts about him that Dad passed down. For example, that he never learned to read or write in either Italian or English. Dad affectionately referred to him as a bilingual illiterate. And that when the family harvested the celery, they always brought along a tub of sugar that they dipped the celery in for energy, celery having no nutritional value of its own. Hence, a part of Salvador's legacy is that my 4 brothers and I grew up thinking that everyone put sugar on their celery. Whenever I visit Lewiston, I always leave a head of celery and a packet of sugar on Salvador's grave, which must give pause to later passers-by. This is more than you need to know about Salvador for the purpose of the poem, but I might also mention that there's a reference in the poem to what locals call the Lewiston Hill, which has so many switchbacks that standing at the bottom of the hill, you can't tell whether the cars are going up or down. With that, here is the poem. Sonnet for Salvador. Of Salvador the Celery King I sing. Illiterate in Lewiston, he'd wander, so I'm told, into the Ladies' John and, barring ladies, not suspect a thing. But when it came to celery, he was king. And when he died, the Lewiston Tribune said, Salvador the Celery King moves on. The celery hung its head, remembering. Sometimes I think I'll wind down Lewiston Hill, where winding up and winding down's the same, except for purpose. Enter past the mill and, turning to face the crowd, announce my name. Gary, son of Dom, the son of Salvador the King, whose throne I've come to claim. Having honored my paternal grandfather, I'd be remiss if I didn't include a poem about my maternal one. His given name was Elam, which he liked to claim was the name of the ass that Christ rode into Jerusalem, but was universally known and loved by his grandchildren as Poo-Poo. He smoked like a chimney, swore like a sailor, and loved to garden, though he limited his horticultural endeavors to flowers. His exclusive brand of cigarettes was Wings, and I recall that when he was dying of emphysema, if he wasn't smoking a Wings, he would be sucking on a portable resuscitator called the Bird. which always struck me as ironic. The poem I'm about to read is called simply The Gardener. It makes no reference to my grandfather by name, but this one is for Poo-Poo. The Gardener. Poetry he would hardly have understood or countenanced. Frost, to him, was what killed flowers. He knew that well enough. Camellia, Mum, Sweet William, he labeled them all with popsicle sticks his grandchildren bequeathed. Out in the garden, his shoes like moldy loaves of bread, his overcoat undone, he strove like any surgeon to preserve. Goldfish could survive the cold, locked in their stone sea, but flowers couldn't. The breath from his mouth made daisies in the air. The real ones died, always. And so it was he recognized death when he saw it coming, blue and clumsy, to claim his lungs. Even in his dreams you could watch him digging in against it, crouching to ward it off. He would lodge his palms for warmth against his chest, testing the soil with the tips of his fingers. The odds didn't matter. It had never been a question of outcome. Poo-Poo's wife, Nanny, appears in at least 4 of my poems. See if you can find her, which is commensurate with her influence on my life. She taught me and my brothers, among other things, one of the most important life lessons I can think of, namely, how to be silly. She and Poo-Poo lived in Bremerton, Washington, which is where I was born. After Pearl Harbor, many people in Bremerton moved inland, fearing that the Bremerton shipyard was going to be the next target. But Poo-Poo worked at the shipyard, and so they stayed there. And one of the most anticipated ventures of my childhood was taking the ferry from Seattle every summer with my brother Ron to visit Nanny and Poo-Poo. Nanny spoiled us rotten, of course, but what I remember most is Nanny's buttermilk pancakes. I've made it a lifelong goal to find their equal, but to no avail. But unable even to find a sound that competes with the whup-whup of Nanny's wooden spoon on the batter bowl. I suspect everyone has such childhood memories that, accurate or not, dwarf mere matter of fact. Given all this, Nanny deserves a happier poem than the one I'm about to read, but I think she'd understand. Mount Auburn Cemetery, Cambridge. Money bought these graves. It makes me think of my grandfather dead in Seattle and the letter they sent his wife explaining, if we don't receive your check by return mail, we will be forced to remove the marker. White petals drop from a rhododendron bush. On the pond, a duck and drake refuse to leave each other's side. Although the pond is so small, a mayfly measures it off over and over before the petals even have time to drift to the bank. I did not see that letter. I only saw my grandmother's face as she told me how she hated to ask for money, and how those men were not bad men, but merely doing their jobs. Her face not angry, but white and very small. I do not know what kind of ducks these are, or if in fact the mayfly is a mayfly. But I know that is a rhododendron bush because it is the state flower of Washington, and also because even the bushes here have markers. Working my way down the family tree from my grandparents to my parents, I never got around to writing the poem about my mother that I was working up to after writing a poem about God, but I do have a poem about my father, who was the sweetest man I've ever known. When we were growing up, we didn't see a lot of Dad. He was too busy working his butt off trying to keep his 5 growing sons fed. He was a title insurance lawyer by profession, the only one of 7 siblings who went to college, but was also an accomplished carpenter. So when he wasn't busy lawyering at Puget Sound Title, he was, as his family grew, often occupied making additions and improvements to our modest house in Seattle's University District. I especially loved to watch him work with a large Stanley bench plane. He made it look ridiculously easy, the shavings lofting softly from his workbench to the floor like fledgling birds. That plane sits in my garage today, though I've never developed the skill to use it. Dad was a quiet man, not one to express much emotion, but he managed to convey by his actions, and indeed by his entire life, that nothing was more important to him than his family. Here is the poem. Buses for my father. I rode a bus today from Somerville to Harvard Square, hardly far enough to find a seat or need one. Still, finding one, I thought of you, who rode for more years than I've lived, buses to and buses home from work. Of how we'd come to meet you down 55th, past Albright's Grocery, Pitt and Pat's, and you, crossing the street, would watch for traffic, pretending you could die, then shade your eyes against the sun to catch a glimpse of sons on bikes and smile. When the world demanded exact change, you said, "What's wrong with tokens?" Dad, you're right, and this is mine. I could have walked today or taken the car, but even for this short distance, I'm with you. On a bus, you can relax. On a bus, you don't have to watch the road. On a bus, you can let the reassuring engine whir like love, knowing your stop is coming, but not yet. I've made several references to my brothers, and indeed the dedication in my collected poems reads, "In memory of my 4 brothers, Ron, Terry, Rick, and Pat." That dedication always reminds me of the time when my son Nicholas was about 12, and we came across a book that had the dedication, "In memory of my father, who taught me how to think for myself." I said to Nicholas, if you should happen to grow up and write a book and say that in a dedication, I'd be very proud. Nicholas replied, "Actually, Papa, you'd be dead." So yes, I am in fact the last remaining survivor of the 5 Miranda boys, a fact that still seems, and probably will always seem, ineffably strange to me. When you grow up with 4 brothers, especially brothers as close in age as we were, you're always aware that, come what may, someone's got your back. I'm not sure what that means in practical terms, but symbolically, it's huge. People sometimes assume when they learn that I'm the last surviving brother of 5 that I might have been the youngest. In fact, however, I was next to the oldest. Which means that while I had 3 younger brothers, I had only 1 older brother, namely Ron. Because of this, Ron was always special to me, and I spent much of my youth trying, unsuccessfully, to be more like him. So when, in my junior year of high school, Ron had what was then referred to as a nervous breakdown and had to be put in an institution, I was lost, especially because, as was common in those days, mental illness was not something that families discussed. In desperation, I began writing down my feelings in the form of what would eventually become poems, though I hardly thought of them as such at the time. I thought all poets were dead. Ron, I hasten to mention, recovered fully and went on to have 5 children of his own. But the time in question became the subject of one of the first poems of mine that was ever published. As an early poem, it suffers, I'm afraid, from being a bit on the nose, to borrow a term from the screenwriting trade, but I include it here nevertheless. It's called The Bruiser, and I like to imagine it in Introduction to Literature anthologies, in which the poem is followed by questions like, who is the bruiser? And is the title ironic? The Bruiser, for my brother. My sophomore year in high school, we played a lot of basketball together. And once, one game against St. John's, I tackled old Moose Farrell at midcourt because he elbowed underneath the board you, who didn't believe in anger. My junior year, they took you away and put you somewhere out of reach. And no one told me who to tackle then, or even talked about it at all. Because it hurt, yes. And 2, because it left a kind of mark, like finger stains. Later on, they let you out from there. Electric shock had cured you, a kind of magic in your mind, like lightning. But still, no one would talk about it. No, not even you. And memory, under our noonday silence, bleached and disappeared. This alone survives from all that year, you in the tub one evening as I shaved, and telling me that I should leave so you could drown yourself. Your eyes unfixed, except on fixtures, and empty like the drain. And still in dreams, I see you drowning, not in tubs, but rivers under boards, and wake in sweat because I cannot save you. And TV shows about the place you went can valve up tears without my knowing why, until I think on it and conjure you. I only say, perhaps we should have talked about it, spread it out across our knees and talked and talked and talked about it until it couldn't hurt us anymore. For how was I to know they hadn't killed you there, you see, and sent me back a new one? I mentioned above that my brothers and I didn't get to spend a lot of time doing things with our father, but one of the things we did do with him on weekends was to go fishing for salmon in Puget Sound. For Dad, fishing for salmon would be redundant. As far as he was concerned, if it wasn't the salmon, it wasn't the fish. The day after Dad's funeral, the 5 of us went down to Ray's boathouse in Ballard and managed to convince the owner to let us use the long-discontinued boat elevator that we always used with Dad to go on a memorial fishing trip. So the 5 of us clambered into a wooden skiff equipped with Dad's 7.5 horsepower Johnson Seahorse and were ceremoniously lowered into the steel-gray waters of Shilshole Bay. For those of you who aren't familiar with nautical terms, freeboard is the distance between the waterline and the top of the boat's hull. Well, in this case, there wasn't any, or none to speak of. After that, for the next 20 years, until my brother Ron died, the Dominic Memorial Fishing Derby became an annual event, with other family members joining us to vie for the coveted trophy. All of that, along with this next poem, Should give you some idea of why, for me, fishing is more than just an idle pastime. Deception Pass. If brothers happen to forget each other, do they dissolve, evaporate, or just thin out to something they'll have to find another name for? The way fog is a name for tall rain left standing after the grazing season. Once, near Deception Pass, in a dense fog the salmon had tricked us into, leaping always too far ahead of the boat. Our eyes became like those dots in the Sunday paper puzzle page, where, even without a pencil, you get the picture. The things brothers don't tell each other can smell blood a mile off, and such silence hooked in their mouths can hurt, whichever way they turn. All men are brothers, or at least that truth is a fog the world likes to get lost in. But brothers know better. No distances are as real as the closeness which separates them. I've lived apart from mine 24 years this year. We phone to celebrate birthdays, a morbid kind of keeping score. I go back home whenever I can. We talk, joke, go fishing. And yet, forging upstream toward their first home, Chinook salmon age in 2 weeks, those 24 years, our time. Some of them die trying. Once again, thank you for listening, and until next time, this is Gary Miranda saying, with Theodore Roethke, wake the happy words.